Thanks for tuning in to the very first episode of the Bright Lights Breakdown. I am your host, Wyatt Bagnall, and today we are going to be reviewing the 2022-2023 NFL season and handing out report cards to all 32 teams. This was a wild year. A lot of very interesting stuff happened, so I'm going to sort of go and put my grading scale in perspective here so you guys have a better grasp of how I'm viewing each of these things. It should be noted that these aren't like conventional grades by any means. I'm grading them relative to my expectations of them heading into the year, which I'll sort of give a brief description of as I go through it. But A is an outstanding year relative to those expectations. No matter how the season ended, these teams could feel good about themselves and feel like they're going to be a contender going into next year. B, this is for teams that had a good season. They didn't quite get to where they should have or were expected to be, though. So they ended up falling a bit short, and they have some work to do in the offseason. C, they met expectations. They were bang average. They weren't impressive beyond that at all. These are teams that are probably one good offseason away from being a contender, but it's contingent on them doing a little bit of work. And then D, these are teams, they just fell short of the expectations. There's a lot of teams that are going to be in this category, and I'll get into the reasons why they fell short. These teams that are towards the bottom tend to have some more interesting analysis to go into them. Then F is pretty simple. You're a train wreck. You fell short of every expectation. Nothing went well. So with that being said, let's get into this. We're going to start off in the AFC East with the Buffalo Bills. I'm giving the Bills a B. It was a good season. They got to the playoffs, but they did not get to where they should have or would have been expected to be, which for a lot of people, myself included, they were thought to be a Super Bowl favorite, a Super Bowl contender. It felt like this was the year they were supposed to break through. That obviously did not happen, and that for a few reasons. Some of that was beyond their control. On the defensive end, injuries sort of ravaged them all year. And by the end, their secondary was just gone. Their pass rush had fallen off once Von Miller got injured. And that was just unfortunate for them. However, there were some things about this team that were exposed. For example, they simply don't have enough weapons to compete. Stephon Diggs is a really good wide receiver. Really, really good. But you need better than Gabriel Davis as your number 2. Dawson Knox is a fine tight end, but you probably want him to be your number 4 option and not your number 3. So they're missing a really good weapon. I personally think that they need to find a way to take a little bit off Josh Allen's plate in terms of just having to be Superman. He takes entirely too many hits, and that started to show. He even got hurt during a point during the year. We have no idea exactly how much that affected him throughout the year, but it certainly didn't help. So the Bills, good year. You got to the playoffs, really good. But, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. They just fell short. You know? They didn't get nearly as far as anyone thought they would. So, can't be an A. The Miami Dolphins. This is an interesting one. So, my thoughts on the Dolphins heading into the year were really talented team. They had a great offseason last year, and it all depended on Tua. And with those expectations in mind, they're going to get a B also. This could have been an A for them because of the huge steps forward they took. But I'm going to say it's a B because it was a really good year for them. They had an awesome year, with the exception of Tua kept getting hurt. And he kept getting concussions, and those are no laughing matter, no small ordeal. And it's tough to be one of those A teams walking out of the year feeling good no matter what, when you have a situation where you might be in the quarterback market again. It's a tough spot to be in because other than that, I thought Miami took some major strides forward. Of course, their defense could get a little bit better. Their O-line could get a little bit better. But they come out with this sort of glaring issue of when Tua played, they were really good, but he couldn't stay out there. So they have some tough decisions to make this offseason. Either they invest in Tua and say, okay, we think you can be the guy, but I think if you do that, you're taking a huge risk, and you better have a really good backup. Um, or they sort of start looking around more, and I wouldn't be shocked if they did that. Frankly, I can't blame them either way. Um, I'll get a little bit more into that during my off-season breakdowns and predictions for all these teams, but yeah, Miami really is a good year, especially considering where they were coming from. They made the playoffs, which they hadn't done in quite a while, and they looked awesome until Tua just went out and couldn't come back. Up next, the New York Jets. Oof. The Jets are tough. Another tough one. My expectations going into the year of them were that they weren't going to be very good. They just they wouldn't they just wouldn't have the firepower to compete in the AFC East. And so, with that being the consideration, I'll say that they're a C, but they're in like the C plus range. They met the expectations, which is they weren't good enough to compete in the AFC East truly, but that defense of theirs was really, really good. Really good. Sauce Gardner had an epic rookie season. Like he was the like in terms of grading, he was the best corner in the league as a rookie. That's very, very rare. Corner is notorious for being difficult to transition to the NFL with. So their draft last year was an A plus, but the overall year, it's like only half the ball looked good because their quarterback position was just catastrophic. Zach Wilson fell short in a lot of ways. I don't know that you can blame everything on him. I think they probably benched him a little prematurely too. They didn't help themselves in terms of how they handled the situation, but he didn't play well. So they're in a situation where they've been a lot of times in the last few years. Their defense is good. They're able to stop teams doing stuff, but they can't score for a damn thing. So they're better than I thought they were going to be, but ultimately they're just stuck with the same problem they've always had. And so with that being said, they get a C. I'll say C plus though, like I said. Then up next, the Patriots. This is another C, man. This is another C, because you could see it going into the year what the problem was going to be for them. Their offensive coaching staff was an absolute nightmare, and it played itself out that way. Matt Patricia and Joe Judge are not equipped to do that, and they've already addressed that this offseason because that was really, really bad. Um, Good on defense, just incompetent on offense. They just they could just never get out of their own way. And they had a couple moments that were just ridiculous this year. They missed the playoffs when in reality they were a team that probably should have been in there. Like they had enough talent to get there. They just couldn't put it all together, and that comes down to that coaching staff. And that puts a lot of interesting pressure onto this team heading into the 2023 season. And I'm very interested to see how that plays out. But overall, for the year, it can't be anything above a C, man. They took a step back. They made the playoffs last year, missed them this year. Had a pretty obvious thing that everybody saw, but came back to bite them. So they're a C. On to the AFC North. We'll start with the Bengals. The Bengals get an A. I had questions about them going into this year because I've seen a lot of teams come out of nowhere, surprise teams, have a magical run to the Super Bowl, even though they didn't win. And I wasn't quite sure that the Bengals could sustain it. And this year they answered all the questions. Good on them. Joe Burrow is a very good quarterback. Jamar Chase is a very good wide receiver. Like all the stuff that you saw last year, or 2 years ago now, it repeated itself. You know, the Bengals look as though they're turning around. They have some interesting questions this offseason as well, which is Joe Burrow's going to get paid. So where does that start to affect the rest of this roster? You know, there's a lot of quarterbacks trying to get paid right now, And it's unfortunate, but a lot of the time when you pay these guys, it basically closes your Super Bowl window. And we're going to see how that goes for the Bengals. I think they're a little bit more safe than some other teams in this position because Joe Burrow, I think, is a very good player. But who knows? It's tough to. It's tough to. How to best phrase it? It feels like the last 2 years might have been their best shot to get one. Because it's the best shot for a lot of teams, and they were able to put a really good team out there. So we'll see. But overall, this year was an A for the Bengals. Really, really good. They look like they're a team that's going to be relevant for a long time. The Steelers and Ravens are obviously never anything to be laughed at, and I think that that's something that he's going to have to deal with more than some other franchise quarterbacks or elite quarterbacks. But yeah, awesome year by the Bengals. They got a lot to feel good about going into this offseason and into next season. We're going to go with the Ravens next. They're a tough one for a few reasons. I'm going to say that they get a C for the year. They met the expectations of being a playoff team, which is basically that's all I really thought of them. They were a playoff team, but they wouldn't go that far. The problem is, which is why I almost felt like bumping them down, but in terms of just performance for the season, they get a C. But the Lamar Jackson thing is obviously a very big deal. And there was some thought that at the end of the year, he wasn't playing purely because of his contract. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But that became the perception of a lot of people. And I don't doubt that that's a part of it, where if he wasn't completely healthy, he was not going to play. So I'm sure part of it is that he was still had some lingering issues. But I think if he had his security, he probably would have gone through and tried it. So we're going to have to see how that plays out for them. I have some opinions on that that I could talk about for a long time, but I think that's probably best saved for my off-season needs video, which will be coming out next week. And here's what I'll say. They cannot give him a fully guaranteed contract, and if he is not willing to budge on that, there are a lot of options for them. So, for the year, it's a C. They made the playoffs, but man, that was sort of a disappointing end to the year because it really felt like if he was playing in that game, they were probably going to beat the Bengals in the wild card round. But obviously, that's not how it went. Up next, we're going to go Steelers. Again, I'm going to give them a B. This is where it gets a little bit weird, where it's no, they did not make the playoffs. So how do they have a B? How do the Ravens have a C? This is where the expectations thing becomes relevant. The Steelers should not have won as many games as they did, and a lot of credit for that goes to Mike Tomlin. I do worry that perhaps the Steelers are getting into that limbo territory of they're not good enough to be a contender, but they're not bad enough to get like game-changing players in the draft for cheap. So that's something to be a little bit worried about is the Steelers could find themselves in this like habitual middle ground. But in terms of this season, everybody thought this was going to be the year that it all falls apart for Pittsburgh. Didn't happen. Kenny Pickett ended up playing pretty well down the stretch. Steelers defense, with and without T.J. Watt, is a big difference. But when T.J. Watt came back, that defense got it together in a lot of ways, and he's a very good player. They fell short of the playoffs in the last week of the year. I think a lot of people expected them to be eliminated from that like several weeks before. So, relative to the expectations, which was this is going to be the year it all falls apart for them, this is a B. You know, they exceeded those expectations. They didn't do anything outstanding or anything like that, but they went 9-8 and were relevant in Week 18. Which, hey, there's a lot of teams that would kill to be in that position. And then last up for the AFC North is the Browns. I'm gonna give them a D. I didn't expect much from them heading into the year, given the whole Deshaun Watson situation. And let's just get this out of the way. Obviously, he's not a great guy, and the contract that they gave him is ridiculous, and it's causing a lot of trouble around the NFL for other teams too. But I'm going to, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to talk much about my thoughts on why Deshaun Watson is not a good person. Everybody already knows that. But I'm just going to talk purely about the Browns season. So, yeah, I'll just get that out of the way. I'm not a supporter of Deshaun Watson. I don't think he should have got the money he got. I think that, the situation's just, that's a crazy situation. That's a ridiculous situation. And the fact that he got rewarded for it with $250 million guaranteed is atrocious. But in terms of the Browns themselves, they started off the year knowing that he was going to be suspended 11 games. So the question was, could they stay afloat long enough to just be ready to potentially make a playoff push when he returned? The answer to that was, of course, no. Jacoby Brissett did a valiant job, and they played some close games, but they just couldn't close them. And so they were sort of out of it by the time Watson returned. But the reason they get a D is not for those first 11 weeks. It's because for the rest of the season, he didn't play particularly well. Now, there's a lot of logical reasons as to why that is. Hasn't played football in almost 2 years, new team, new everything. I get it. Perhaps this was just like in a big extended preseason for him. That is completely possible. I don't discount that at all. But it's tough to watch that and feel great. So this upcoming year is huge for them. Because if he just lost it, if he's not able to look like Houston Deshaun Watson for the Browns, then they have a huge problem on their hands in terms of that contract and everything else that already hovers around him. So, yeah, it's tough to say that they're going to get any type of positive grade. It's a D for them. They weren't an awful team. They weren't an atrocious team, but they did fall short in a lot of ways. On to the AFC South. The AFC South and the NFC South are like the two least interesting divisions in the sport. AFC South. Let's start with the Jaguars. Why not? Jaguars. They're going to get an A. Relative to expectations, which is they still weren't going to be good. They still had a lot of building to do. There was just so many question marks after that disastrous Urban Meyer experiment. I was never out on Trevor Lawrence like some people were because of just he was not in a situation to have any type of success. And this year started off a little rocky, but they rallied and they ended up winning the division. Some of that has to do with the collapse of the Titans and less to do with them, but they did what they could do, which was win the games they needed to win. And in the end, they made the playoffs, and they won a playoff game in outstanding fashion, coming back from 27-0. So, relative to expectations, this was an outstanding year for the Jags. So, yeah, they get an A. They got a lot to be excited about going into next year. They got some work to do, definitely, to take another step forward. But this was a big year. Trevor Lawrence, we don't really have a lot of questions about him right now. I think you just got to put him in a situation where he has some more weapons and really try to give him every opportunity to maximize his skill set, which is vast. There's a reason he was the consensus top prospect since Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck. So, yeah, great year by the Jags. Hey, Tennessee Titans. There's no way to call this anything but a D. They're not a train wreck. That is reserved for very few teams, but boy, did they not end the year on a hot streak. It looked like they had this division locked up for about half the year until they just collapsed down the stretch. My expectations of them were to win this division because I just didn't think this division was very good. And, I didn't think they would win this division, actually. I thought they would be in second place. We'll get to my potentially worst prediction of the year with who I thought would win the AFC South here in a minute. But ultimately, I thought that they would be a fringe playoff team. They were a fringe playoff team technically, but it's not because they were good. It's because they were in a division that was just like pretty open to be taken. If they were in any other division, they would have been eliminated way before. So it's a D, man. Everybody saw it coming when they traded AJ Brown. They did not have enough weapons, not even close, and they didn't really do much to address it. Traylon Burks started to come on toward the end of the year, but ultimately, I mean, he couldn't stay healthy. He couldn't stay on the field. They couldn't throw the ball. Their offensive line took several steps backwards, which affected Derrick Henry. When you know that they have to run it and your offensive line can't block it on top of that, even Derrick Henry can't overcome that. So their issues on offense were predictable, and I think that's what makes it so disappointing, which is like, I don't know, they should have paid AJ Brown. I think there's only a few players in this league that you should really be willing to pay at this point, given how it goes, with like these players really being overpaid in a lot of ways. But AJ Brown was a player that was worth paying, and I can't believe that they let him go. And I think in a lot of ways that cost them a trip to the playoffs. So yeah, D for Tennessee. We'll go Houston next. The Houston Texans. They get a D also because they fell short of a very simple expectation, which for me was get the number one pick. Like, be the worst team in the league, get the number one pick, and get the guy that can turn your franchise back around. And Houston couldn't even tank it right. They choked away the number one pick in the last week of the year. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are like, they should be commended for competing, yada, yada, yada. Sure, whatever you want to say, man. That will set the Houston Texans back potentially years. Unless they're going to be just awful again and try to get Caleb Williams or Drake May next year. But, man, they let Chicago get the number one pick, and now everyone's like, oh, it's easy. Chicago doesn't need a quarterback. They'll do this, they'll do that. Dude, Chicago's going to trade that pick, or they're going to evaluate the guys in this class and say, we'll take one of them and trade away Justin Fields. There's a lot of options here for the Chicago Bears. And ultimately, it now doesn't make sense for the Texans to trade up, because guess what? For the Texans to trade up, they're going to get in a bidding war with teams below that who want that pick. And that means the Texans are going to have to pay more to move up one spot. I mean, it was such a bad move to win that game. I mean, if I was Texans ownership and front office, I mean, it's basically what they did, but I wouldn't have even gone down to that locker room at the end of that Week 18 game. I would have been so pissed off. It's like you were so close to getting what you needed, and you screwed it up. The perfect example of this is like when the Jets were just sinking, and everyone's like, Trevor Lawrence is going to be a Jet, and then they win, was it one game or two games? No, 2 games to just screw it all up. And then the Jags got Trevor Lawrence, and they got Zach Wilson, and now look where they are. So I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's good that they were staying competitive. It's good that they were staying competitive, but it's bad the way that they ended it, you know? So D for the Texans. You couldn't even be the worst team in the NFL correctly. Indianapolis Colts. Now, this is where I'm handing out my first F. I thought the Colts were going to win the AFC South. I did acknowledge before the year that they were missing weapons. But even I could not see coming the complete and total destruction and annihilation of the Colts almost every week. I mean, it's ridiculous. They were so completely incompetent on the offensive side of the football. They were legitimately painful to watch. I remember the Colts-Broncos Thursday night game, and as it's getting to the end, it's like, oh my God, please don't make us watch overtime with this goddamn game. It was the worst game I'd ever seen. I was so bored. Because there's a difference between good defense, having a game be low scoring, and just bad offense. What that game was just bad offense everywhere between two teams that were just horrible. And yeah, I thought the Colts, I was like, Matt Ryan's got enough left just to stabilize them enough to get to the playoffs and win a bad AFC South. And boy, was I wrong. And boy, was a lot of people wrong. The Colts were an absolute train wreck. And so they get the first F out of everybody here. On to the AFC West. Chiefs, they obviously get an A plus. You know, they won the Super Bowl, so they obviously feel great about themselves. Not a ton to say about them really when recapping the season here. Um, they showed they could play a different style of offense without as many deep shots. Uh, yeah, they won the Super Bowl, man. So, A, plain and simple. I guess if I'm to provide a little more context to them, so that they showed that they can win in a variety of ways. Their defense still isn't good, and their running game is underused, but Pacheco proved to be like a good back. I do still worry about eventually some of the weapons on that team, but it didn't show itself this year, mostly because Travis Kelce is a really good tight end. We can have conversations later about where do we ultimately think Mahomes and Kelce and guys like that will fall in terms of all-time legacy. But for this year, it was enough. But they need to start being aware that Kelce's getting up there in age a little bit. I don't think he's going to fall off next year, probably, but you never truly know, especially as they get older and they keep getting hit and stuff like that. But, yeah, I mean, when you walk out with the Lombardi Trophy, it's an A+ year. So, great job by the Chiefs. We're gonna go with the Chargers next. Okay, this is a tougher one. I'm torn between B and C for them. I'm gonna go with the C because they left me with a real sour taste in my mouth, and because my expectations of them going into this year was they would be a playoff team. I thought that they would be a really good team, though. Like, I thought that they would be a contending team at the end, and they weren't that. It was a good season because it's like they took a step forward. They're a tough team to grade because they do the same thing every single year, and this is why I'll say they met expectations. Every single year, the Chargers are the offseason darling. Everybody loves them, and throughout the course of the year, we all realize, oh, they're still the Chargers, and they let us down in the end. So they get a C for meeting expectations of they had an awesome roster. Everybody thought they looked great. And then they just absolutely collapsed. And there was no better example of it than in the playoff game. They blow a 27-0 lead to the Jaguars to lose in the playoffs. It's like, wow, man. That's one of the most Charger things I've ever seen. But hey, it's what they did. And I'm already a little more out on them than I normally am this offseason, purely because they kept Brandon Staley. I mean, I think that that's about as bad a move as you can do, especially when you watch Sean Payton go to the Broncos. So, yeah, I mean, I already have my same expectations with the Chargers. Everybody's going to think that roster looks great, and then they're just going to absolutely let you down again. They're just going to eat it again. And that's all it is. So, Chargers, they meet expectations because those expectations are just that they will always find a way to break your heart. So, great job by them. Up next, we're going to go with the Las Vegas Raiders. I'm going to give them a D. They fell short of expectations. I thought that they would be good, not a playoff team. I thought that they would regress from that because I thought that they were very lucky to be in the playoffs 2 years ago. I still thought that they would be a fringe playoff team and a team that was relevant, but man, the way that they lost games was just tragic. Like, they were another team that just could not hold a lead to save their life. They blew so many 10-point leads that you never fell out of a game with the Raiders, and it's possible that they get better. I think they will. Their defense was just atrocious all year. Derek Carr obviously is going to be gone. Not necessarily because he played poorly, but I do think that there are times when a relationship just sort of runs its course. and it's probably best for everyone to move on. And I think that that's where the Raiders were at with Derek Carr. Can't blame him for it, and we'll see where he lands. But they gotta address that quarterback spot before we have any real thoughts about what they can be next year. But overall, they fell short of my expectations that they were going to be a good team and a fringe playoff team. Last up in the AFC, we got the Denver Broncos. It's you could give them an F, but I'm going to give them a D for one very specific reason. Not everything on that team was a train wreck. It would be disingenuous, at least for me, to call a team that had that good of a defensive unit an F. The offensive side of the ball was an absolute F, but the defensive side of the ball was like an A. So overall, they just fell short. So they're going to get a D because their defense was outstanding. Their offense was abysmal. But they did show some signs of life towards the end of the year after they fired Nathaniel Hackett. And I don't know if that's indicative of what's possible, but if it is, hiring Sean Payton will, we'll find out. We'll find out who exactly the problem was this year. Yeah, not a good year for the Broncos. They fell way short of expectations. This is about as low on the scale as you can get for a D. So yeah, this is like a D minus minus. But I just can't call them I can't give them an F when their defense played that well and kept them in that many games. So they're a D. On to the NFC. We're going to start in the NFC East. We'll go with the Eagles first. A. Great year. They got to the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, didn't win. We can argue all day about if they deserve to be in the Super Bowl and the quality of competition that they ultimately faced during the year, yada, yada, yada. I understand that there's a lot of questions about that type of stuff, but ultimately, when you get to the Super Bowl at all, you're feeling good. And so it's an A for the Eagles. Jalen Hurts answered all the questions about him. He's going to be the guy in Philly for a while. And the A.J. Brown trade looks like a freaking steal. And ultimately, they get to feel good about themselves because they have one of the best front offices in the league. I have no idea exactly how good Nick Sirianni is because I never really felt like they outcoached a bunch of people or anything like that. They sort of felt like a college team where it was just they got to play a bunch of teams that really couldn't hang with them. So we didn't see them in a ton of situations where like situational awareness or like a great play here or there was going to be the difference. So, but I mean, hey, got to the Super Bowl. So, hey, Dallas Cowboys, B. Good season. Didn't get to where they wanted to be. They wanted to at least be in the Final Four. And obviously they wanted to be in the Super Bowl. My expectations of them were that they would be a playoff team, but not a particularly like great team. They sort of did what you expected. The old like Cowboys joke at this point, which is they're good enough to get there and then they'll choke it away. They didn't choke away anything this year. San Fran just beat them, and it is what it is. That last play was hilarious though, but it was a good season. But it wasn't where they should have or where they expected to be. So they get a B though. The Giants. I mean, relative to expectations, it's an A. So I'll give them an A. I expected them to be awful. Me and a lot of people, we all thought that they were one of the worst teams in the league, and they got to be feeling good about themselves in some sense. I think that they were obviously fool's gold. Everybody knew that. There was a couple teams in the NFC feel that way about, but they're going to probably take a step back this year unless they have a really good offseason. Unfortunately, this isn't an offseason with a ton of premier free agents where the Giants can really bolster and like keep themselves there. Especially when you hear that like Daniel Jones wants a $45 million a year like paycheck. I mean, you laugh that out of the room. Obviously, it's either hey, you take something in the 20s, or we're going to slap a franchise tag on you and find out what you really are. So, it is what it is. Dable won Coach of the Year because he did a great job. The reason he won that Coach of the Year though was this isn't a very talented team, but they still got to the playoffs, and when you're a bad team that overachieves that much, you get an A. And you just hope that you're able to sustain some of that heading into the next year and that you can at least maintain that level. It's tough to outperform every year, but maybe they can do it. Maybe they found some guys this year. Up next, the Washington Commanders. I mean, they can have a C. They were relevant enough throughout the year, and didn't expect them to be that much. But I mean, hey, they were fine. They weren't the worst team in the league or anything like that. They got a good coach with Rivera. Quarterback's always an issue with them. That defense got better throughout the year. The one thing I'm really, really, really watching right now is Chase Young has essentially had 2 years wiped out by an injury, the same injury that he got about halfway through his second season, and he came back. It really didn't look like himself, and this year, this fourth season for him is going to be really important. He showed a lot of flashes in his rookie year, but he hasn't really shown much at all since then. Even before he got the injury in his second year, he sort of was having a lackluster season. So we'll see. Chase Young's an interesting choice because they got to make a choice on his 5th-year option here, which will say a lot about how they feel about him. I expect them to pick it up, but we'll see. Yeah, Washington was one of those teams this year that was just like completely bang average for a lot of reasons, and yeah, so C for Washington. I don't think they're one good offseason away from being a contender, but I don't know. I don't think that they're going to be a train wreck anytime soon. On to the NFC North. We'll start with the Vikings. I'm going to give them a B because it was a good season. There's obviously some huge contingencies about them, such as the fact that basically everybody thought that they were fraud, and nobody really respected much of what they did throughout the year. Listen, where'd they go? 13-4, 12-5, something like that. Yeah, I think so. That's super impressive, and that can't be discounted. The way that they won a lot of games, though, is something that's not sustainable. They won, I think, 11-0 in one-score games during the regular season. That will not happen heading into next year. That's just not something that can be done every single time. And the other issue was, if they weren't in a super close one-score game with you, they were getting blown out like 40-3 by the Cowboys. So the whole year is just like every time they got a real test, they just fell way short. But all the other times they won, and they won close games and crazy games, and they got to the playoffs and they lost. But it could have been worse. The Vikings have been a team that sort of felt like they were treading water for a while, and this year felt like a step forward. Not as far as like their record would indicate, but a tangible step forward, where they'll still win some of those close games next year. They'll still, like, Justin Jefferson will still be awesome next year. They have a lot of stuff to be optimistic about. The biggest thing that they absolutely have to do if they want to repeat as like NFC North champs and playoff team and all that type of stuff, that defense has to get better. That was one of the worst defenses in the league. It might have been the worst defense in the league by the end of it all. There were a few teams vying for it. But Minnesota's was glaring because they were the reason they were in a lot of close games instead of blowing people out. So they get a B, but it's not an A because there's a lot of questions and there was a lot of fool's gold about them this year. Green Bay Packers, C. I expected them to take a step back, and they did. They didn't have the weapons. Some guys came on towards the end, but yeah, this was sort of how you thought the year would go for the Packers. I think the most disappointing thing was their defense wasn't as good as expected, but I mean, overall, this was sort of how I saw the Packers year going, and that's fine. Aaron Rodgers, we're doing the same song and dance with him this offseason as we have for a few years now.
where will he, won't he, does he want to leave, does he want to retire? I don't really care. I mean, given all the speculation, he's probably just going to go back to Green Bay and make it boring. But I don't know. The Packers, they got to deal with that. That situation's got to be wrapped up because if you're going to keep Rodgers, you're going to have to trade Jordan Love. There's no way that you force that kid to sit behind him for another year and completely waste his rookie contract. So yeah, Green Bay, it's a C. They one good offseason to work, and they could be a real contender depending on that quarterback situation. All right, we'll go Detroit Lions next. This is the rare playoff. This is the rare team that missed the playoffs that's going to get an A because they took a huge step forward. Started off slow, but really were trending upwards by the end. And at the end of the regular season, man, I would have rather have seen them in the playoffs than the Seahawks. The Seahawks were a team that as soon as you saw that they were going to go to San Fran and play the 49ers, you were like, yeah, okay, it's over for Seattle there. Nobody really thought Seattle had a chance to go in and beat the 49ers. The Lions could have made it interesting, though, because the Lions had a really good offense, a young defense that was starting to come together towards the end of the year. And, yeah, I think that there's really a ton to be optimistic about in Detroit. A ton. If they don't make the playoffs next year, I think you're disappointed probably. But, I mean, coming off this year, this is a team that was awful. Awful for a while. And for 2 years now, you feel like they're starting to really put it together. 2 years ago, they were just this feisty team that would lose a lot of the games, but they were all really close games. This year, it looked like it was going to be like that again, which was disappointing. But they ultimately came out, put it together, and they started to figure out how to win those close games. And by the end of the year, they were one of the hottest teams in the league. They only lost one game down the stretch, and it cost them a playoff spot, unfortunately. But hey, that's tangible progress. That's like how you map it out type of progress when you talk about like turning a franchise around. You go from awful to like you're competitive in the games. You probably fall short, but it's closer. Then the next year, you just flip that where it's like now we're trying to win some of these close games, and then another good offseason, and hey, that's a real team probably. So I'm excited about the Lions. Last up, the Bears for the NFC North. Okay. This is a weird one, but I'm going to call it a B. Here's why. They were the worst team in the league technically because of, they got the number one pick. But the way they got to the number one pick is about as good as you could ask for, where they were like the Lions 2 years ago, where it's like they were really, really competitive in a lot of games. They were close. Their offense was looking really good. Justin Fields was showing he's a dynamic runner. They need more weapons. They need receivers because right now he's looking really bad as a thrower, but I don't really think that's his fault. But I mean, it's about as good as you can ask for to be competitive in a lot of games, but just still lose them because you're a team that needs a lot of help anyways. And they ultimately get a gift from the Texans, and they get the number one pick. And now they can do whatever they want. Get an absolute haul for it. My personal thing would be you trade it to the Colts, get 2 first-round picks from them, and then you still get Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, whichever one's still there for. But yeah, I mean, obviously they weren't good. Their defense wasn't good. They cleaned house on that side of the ball, and they have a lot of work to do. But I mean, in terms of ways to get the number one pick, there's very few ways that leave a lot of optimism. But the Bears got it. So ultimately, I think it worked out pretty well for them. So they weren't good, but I'll get them a B just for how it worked out. All right, on to the NFC South. Okay. There's not one team in here that's going to get an A or a B. Nobody in this division was freaking good. So we'll start off with Tampa Bay. They get a D because they fell short of expectations even though they won the division. They were supposed to be a team that was an actual contender, a team that people would actually have to reckon with. But instead, they were the team where it's like, hey, if you get to play Tampa Bay in the first round of the playoffs, this is a gift. And it was. So, yeah, there's no way to describe the Buccaneers' year without calling it disappointing. I mean, what a difference a year makes. I mean, Byron Leftwich last offseason, people were looking at as being a head coach. This offseason, he's fired. I mean, that Buccaneers coaching staff really, really did not do well this year, which I think is really dangerous. And we'll get into that a little bit more. I've got another video coming out where we're going to discuss the coaching hires this year and the potential vacancies next year. And I guess I'll just spoil it now, obviously. I mean, Tampa Bay is one of those jobs where Todd Bowles, I mean, this was a team that was a Super Bowl contender or thought to be. And instead you finished the year with a losing record pretty much. Or was it 9-8 or something like that? 9-8, 8-9. But you finish the year like eking into the playoffs in the most abysmal division in the sport. I mean, you took losses to Carolina, Atlanta. I mean, you got over the hump and beat the Saints. But I guess in terms of positives, there's that for you. But no, there's just not a lot to feel good about coming out of the year if you're the Buccaneers. So that's a D. Who be next? Let's go Carolina. Carolina. I'll give them a C because they sort of rallied enough down the stretch where you're like, all right, you weren't awful. I mean, the first half of the year was an absolute joke. They fire They fire Matt Rule. They trade away Baker Mayfield. And we're dealing with like P.J. Walker and Sam Darnold playing quarterback the rest of the year. But interim head coach Steve Wilkes did a really awesome job, man. And he rallied them down the stretch and almost got them to the playoffs. Granted, ultimately, I think it's the best thing for them that they didn't make the playoffs because they would have just gone into the playoffs, got beat, but then just have a way worse draft pick. They need some help. And it's good that I think ultimately it's good that they missed out. Just get the pick, improve your team, and come back stronger. Frank Reich is a good hire as a head coach. I wouldn't have minded if they just let Steve Wilkes keep the job. But now he gets to go to San Fran and be their defensive coordinator, and they've been churning out head coaches there with their last two guys. So maybe this ultimately worked out best for everyone. So yeah, I'll give Carolina a C because they ended up, they steadied the ship. They got through the storm. They stopped the bleeding. Pick your analogy for them. They weren't good, but ultimately they were the team probably felt the best about in the NFC South coming out of the year. We'll go with the Saints next. I mean, they get a C also. They just they were a team that there really wasn't much to say about them the whole year. Their defense was a little underwhelming, but they still showed in certain games that they can be a good unit. But that quarterback situation, they got to get that resolved. Jameis can't stay healthy at this point. It looks like he's now had 2 years, I think, where injuries messed him up. And Andy Dalton came in, did an admirable job in terms of how he played, but it just never came together to amount to wins. And yeah, I mean, not much else to really say about the Saints. They got some work to do. They're a team that's pretty talented, but they're always up against the cap. I've been a proponent for a few years now that the Saints just eat a year, and I think this is sort of the year to do it, where just accept you're going to be awful, clean house, put yourself in a position to go and get Caleb Williams or Drake May next year because they need a quarterback badly. And, I mean, their team, they're like one of those teams that just sort of like, they're in a holding pattern. They're just in the same place. They got a talented enough roster to never be the worst team in the league, but they're not going to win a Super Bowl anytime soon as like currently constructed. So I think New Orleans has some tough decisions to make, but I think if they make them correctly, they could be in position to change their franchise for the better. So yeah, we'll give them a C. They were just right down the middle in a lot of ways. Last up, the Falcons. I mean, they can get a C also. It's odd. The one team in this division that won the division is the one that has the lowest grade for the year ultimately, but it's just because they just fell so far short of what we all thought of them. But Atlanta C, I mean, they weren't a good team. There was like a 3 or 4 week stretch in the middle of the year where they were a fun team to watch, and you had like this sense of optimism, but it all just sort of fell apart as the season wore on, and they leveled out to like where we all thought they were, which was they're not a good football team, and that's fine. They've been having to deal for a few years now with the ramifications of the previous regime there, with some bad contracts. They finally offloaded Matt Ryan. It was a necessary step. And part of that is sometimes I think this is what the Saints need to do, man. Sometimes you just have to eat it for a year. And that's what the Falcons did. I have no idea if they're going to draft a quarterback. They could be a team that might want to go after Lamar Jackson. I think that could work interestingly in Atlanta. But yeah, I mean, it's a C. They did what they had to do this year. They're going through the growing pains. They're taking their lumps right now, and that's what you got to do to come out the other side of it. On to the NFC West. We'll go San Fran first. A. San Fran's another team that gets an A. Basically, it's if you got to the Final Four this year, you get an A. Especially because the 49ers ultimately weren't even eliminated by skill. They were eliminated by bad luck. And there's just not much to be said about that. That doesn't have much to do with you being flawed. It just has to do with on that day, it's impossible to win the NFC Championship when you can't throw the football. So here's how I'll put it for the 49ers. If the Kansas City Chiefs lost Patrick Mahomes, would their backup lead them to 8-0? If the Philadelphia Eagles lost Jalen Hurts, we know that they couldn't do it. They went 0-2 with their number 2 quarterback. If the Bengals lost Joe Burrow, would they go 8-0 with their 3rd string guy, much less their 2nd string guy? No. The 49ers did an unprecedentedly good job in really, really difficult circumstances at the quarterback position. Which, again, it's unfortunate because they're a team that have been in that situation for a little bit now. And I truly do believe this. I believe the best team in the league this year was the 49ers. And that had they moved on from Jimmy Garoppolo 3 years ago now, when Tom Brady came out as a free agent, they would have won 2 Super Bowls. So, yeah, they get an A for being an outstanding football team, but bad luck took them out. And we'll see what they do this offseason. They're probably going to be in the same type of situation where you don't know what they have at quarterback necessarily, but the rest of that team is just so damn good that it just might not matter. So, yeah, 49ers get an A all the way. Seattle, they get a B. They exceeded expectations. They weren't a team that anybody really thought was like a contender or anything like that, but a lot of people thought the Seahawks would be picking in the top 10, and ultimately they are because of the Broncos. But a lot of people thought that they would be in the top 10 because of their own performance, and that's just not how it went. Whether or not Geno Smith is actually that good, he's probably not. And we saw it throughout the year. He sort of leveled off, went downhill a little bit. Didn't play awful, but I mean, Geno Smith's not a quarterback that you fear going against. I'll put it that way. But ultimately, hey, Seattle, they played well enough. Their defense isn't good, but their offense was. So, got to the playoffs in a weaker NFC. Good on them. Got eliminated by the 49ers in a pretty predictable turn of events. So, good on them. I don't know exactly how good they'll be next year because it really will be all reliant on Geno Smith. Granted, he's a free agent, so if they want to, they can shake it up. And with that number 5 overall pick, they could take somebody. And like C.J. Stroud, Will Levis, Bryce Young, however these guys end up being ranked, Anthony Richardson, they could all be in play for the Seahawks at 5 if they're really thinking about it, or if a deal with Geno Smith doesn't get done. So we'll see. But overall, good year, exceeded expectations, but you know, they still, you're not feeling awesome about them heading into the offseason, but they were good. Oh gosh, two teams. Okay, Rams or Cardinals? Let's go Rams. They won the Super Bowl. We'll talk about them before the Cardinals. Rams. I mean, listen, we're gonna give an F. They were not good this year. They didn't have any. They didn't really have any time this year where people where they showed to be a really good team. Everyone's gonna point to injuries. That's fine. You can point to that. Those definitely did not help. But the fact that, I mean, I called it heading into the season that the Rams just simply, they don't have the depth. Their star players aren't quite as good as everyone thinks they are, other than Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald is legit. But everybody else on that team, it's sort of like, yeah, okay, they're fine. And the Bills came in and routed them to start the year, and that just sort of set the tone for the season, you know? They couldn't do anything right, really. Didn't have much to contribute. And, I mean, by week 6, their season was basically over. And so that's a train wreck, especially when you're coming off a year where you won the Super Bowl. I mean, it was the worst defense of a Super Bowl title in history. So that's an F. Cardinals, same thing. Another F. They just could never get it together, man. Normally they start off strong and sputter out, but this year they never even started strong. And then the injuries came in and beat them up even further, and by the end of the year they just couldn't win a damn game. They couldn't even get close to winning a game. And they're also an F because they went and ruined and wasted the end of J.J. Watt's Hall of Fame career. I don't know who it was, but whatever person managed to convince him to go there over Green Bay, Buffalo, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, man, whoever that person was, J.J. Watt needs to never talk to them again because that's brutal. And, you know, Cardinals obviously cleaned house after the season, got a new coach in there with Jonathan Gannon. We'll see how it goes. Kyler Murray tore his ACL and won't even be ready to probably halfway through the season. I mean, there's just not a lot to be optimistic about in Arizona. So, is what it is. But, yeah, that covers all 32 teams. Thanks so much for listening. Hit that like and subscribe button. Helps out a lot. I would appreciate it. And, yeah, see you next time.